Hello and welcome to this edition of Leaders of Africa Live. It's good to be with you. My name is Peter Pinar, and I am your host for today's conversation about the impact of COVID-19 on economics, as well as plans for economic revitalization in the future. It's really good to be with you today. The impact of COVID-19, also known as the coronavirus, is being felt around the globe, including African countries. Today, we discuss the economic implications and brainstorm ideas for changing the economic systems, as well as promoting economic growth and embracing this new normal. Welcome to Leaders of Africa Live. What's really nice about today's session is that it is supposed to be interactive. So let me talk about some ways in which you can interact in the audience. The first way you can interact is by going to leadersofafrica.org/live. So if you go there, you will open our website and you will see that this live transmission is embedded there, as well as the chat. And so that chat to the right, you can use that chat to put your comments, put your thoughts in real time. And what we are going to be doing as we go through our conversation is we're going to be sharing some of those comments live with you. And our panelists, who I will introduce in a moment, will be discussing some of the comments and ideas that you come up with. So please share your ideas in the chat. The second way in which you can engage is engage by calling into our discussion today. And this is a real unique feature and something that we think is really important for engagement. And how do you call in? Well, if you go to leadersofafrica.org/live, you will notice that there is a button right underneath this transmission. If you're watching, it will be right down below. What you do is you click that link, it will open up a Zoom meeting, and you will be put into a waiting room. Once you're in that waiting room, our producers will screen your call, so they will let you into the room, they will discuss with you what you want to say on air, and then if your comment fits with what we're talking about, then you will be shared on air. You'll be able to have your voice, and if you have video and your internet is good, we will also be able to show your video live. And of course, our panelists will respond to that. And the last thing to mention is, after the broadcast or during the broadcast, whenever you see fit, please feel free to give us feedback. The feedback button is located right underneath the chat. So please feel free to answer a brief set of survey questions as we go. And again, welcome to today's discussion. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to set the stage a little bit for today's discussion. So let me put this graphic on the screen for you. So what we are going to be talking about is the economic impact. And obviously the spread is continuing, and the virus has claimed the lives of many people around the world, including on the African continent, and including major figures such as Abba Kyari, President Buhari's former chief of staff. We are also beginning to see this impact in the economic area. And the African Development Bank indicated that overall growth rate was 3.4% for 2019 and predicted a 3.9% growth rate in 2020 and a 4.1% growth rate in 2021. This is, of course, before COVID-19, these projections. Now the future is a lot less certain. Mm-hmm. According to the World Bank, there is a projected loss of between 37 and 79 billion in lost output, with a contraction ranging between -2% GDP per growth rate per annum and 5.1% for 2020, that is this year. And of course, the effects can be felt even more when it comes to individuals and their own livelihoods, their own households, of which we are going to be reflecting on today. Which is now, at this time, I want to bring our guests, our esteemed panelists today. And we are joined by two esteemed panelists. We have, right next to me, we have Gloria Nzeka, who is an expert in communications as well as international development. Gloria is a member of the Leaders of Africa core team, and she joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Gloria, today. And we
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. And of course, we are also joined by a special guest, Professor Kwame Yeboah. Kwame serves as an assistant professor of international development at Michigan State University, and he comes to us today from Lansing, Michigan. Welcome, Kwame, to today's discussion.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
It's great to have you both. So let's get into our discussion today. And of course, we're going to hopefully be fielding some comments. So again, just to remind the audience, feel free to put your comments in the chat and call in on Zoom. So my first question has to do with communication issues and communicating the lockdown. And I really want to start with the lockdown effects first.
Yes.
How are lockdowns being communicated to citizens, and how were they being communicated to citizens if they're now being lifted? And what do you see, Gloria, in particular, the strengths and weaknesses of different communication strategies pursued by different African countries?
Well, Peter, I would say when we first started hearing about the coronavirus, and especially when it started spreading to Africa, there was a lot of fears. And what we were hearing from countries like China, the US, and Europe, who were already dealing with the pandemic, is that the best way to deal with this disease is to lock down and to avoid crowds. And so this is what our governments had. And so many of them started implementing lockdown measures. But again, we're dealing with different regions here. Again, it's difficult to compare what's happening in Africa to what's happening in the US. We have different cultures, different economies and infrastructure. And although our government, started moving in the direction of applying lockdown measures, I think they neglected to look at the circumstances that were unique to Africa, in terms of putting in place safety nets for the poor, putting certain socioeconomic measures. And so I think that's the area where our government could have done better. Instead of just communicating that everybody has to stay home, try to look at the majority of our population. How do they live? Most people live on rely on an informal economy, and I think there should have been emphasis on those socioeconomic protections for the poor people.
Now, did they use any particular public education strategies or materials, either broadcast media or press conference that they held to disseminate that information? In what forms, in other words, was a lot of this information disseminated to folks?
I'll take an example of the DRC, my home country. What I know is that the Minister of Health started he was conducting press conferences quite regularly, and I think he still does. That's one of the things. TV and radio in Africa especially radio, is like the most used medium. That's how most people get their information. I think they went through TV and radio, but also what I saw is that our health ministers and our governments started creating social media pages, because that's where, again, a lot of people are. I am aware of, for instance, a Twitter account that was created by the Congolese government that is specific for the coronavirus, and that's where the government releases any new information. So it's a Twitter account and a Facebook account. So Facebook, again, is one of the mostly used social media platform back in Africa. So those are the places where they've moved into. That's where they're operating right now.
So Kwame, I'm curious about the lockdown and how it affected different areas. So we've just heard of some strategies that were used for communication, as well as some of Gloria's concerns. I'm just curious about how the lockdown effects were felt in different areas of the country. And what I mean by that is, rural versus urban areas, as well as, I think what is important to emphasize is different sectors of the economy that were affected in very different ways. So why don't you kind of paint us a picture for what that looked like?
Peter, thank you very much for that question. Let me start by saying that when we look at the number of cases and death that is happening on the continent compared to other regions of the world, like Europe and in the US, it has largely been smaller. But those numbers have kept rising. And there's also the possibility that the limited number of testing may be obscuring the true picture that we are seeing. But nevertheless, the economic toll from these social distancing and the lockdown measures that have been taken is beginning to grow. And you rightly mentioned some of those numbers, and there have been several projections which all indicates that there is certainly going to economic growth is certainly going to be lower than what was originally forecasted. So, for example, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has revised the Africa economic growth projections down to from about 3.2 to about 1.8. But there's that recent estimates coming from AU indicates that it could go as low as about negative 8%. That is, if we're able to contain this pandemic within 5 months with minimal damage to the economy. But the economic impact varies across sectors. There are certain sectors that have been harder hit than others. So, for example, the agriculture and food sector has been hit. And I will just give a few examples. This is a time where the harvest for the 2019-20 season should be reaching markets to help provide incomes for millions of smallholder farmers. But this is also the time where those lockdown and border closures are restricting access to market to these agricultural products. So this is going to lead to a lot of income and livelihood losses for the millions of smallholder farmers that depend on that, and as well as the micro and small and medium enterprises that dominate the distribution of those of those agricultural food products. Now, we are also entering a major planting season, and that disruption in the supply chains of inputs is also going to affect the ability of farmers to be able to get that needed inputs. Mind you that much of agricultural production occurs in the rural areas, which is largely only affected by the lockdown. But the agricultural inputs, most of them, like the seeds, the fertilizers, the machinery, are imported, and they flow from the urban centers to the rural areas. So the longer we have these lockdown, the less likely that the farmers will get the input that they need to be able to plant. Now, the other sector that have also been hit is the oil and the mining sector. So the restrictions on travel has drastically reduced the demand for oil. And this has also been compounded by that Russia and Saudi Arabia price war. And we've seen oil prices tumbled and now have gone as low as about $20 a barrel. Now, so those oil producing countries like Nigeria, like Angola, are going to experience significant losses because oil alone accounts for almost about 90% of export from these countries. And recent estimates indicate that both countries could lose up to about $65 billion in income. And then we can talk about the tourism and aviation sector. So the tourism sector alone, if you look at 2018, contributed about 8.5% to GDP. And it employs millions of people on the continent. With the restrictions on travels, we are seeing limited patronage in this particular sector. And a number of, there's a number of travel agents, and we're also seeing a number of hotels that are shutting down. And estimating that about 2 million jobs could be lost in these areas, and the revenue losses could go up as high as about $50 billion. So that is how some of these areas have currently been impacted.
I think that really painted a really nice picture of both from smallholding farmers to sort of these large industries that may be influenced. And you mentioned also the airline industry. And I know that it's not like some of these industries may have been doing well before COVID-19, right? If we think about the South African airlines, for example, they've been operating at losses for many years. I know Kenyan Airways has also struggled financially as well. So it's not like a lot of these big companies, for example, were already healthy and doing very well before COVID-19. And so what do you expect sort of the government to respond to some of these challenges? I just want to reflect first on sort of those larger industries. Do you expect to see governments attempt to sort of inject a certain amount of capital or cash to some of these countries that are distressed, in your view, Kwame?
I think the approach that various governments is going to take might differ, depending on the physical space that the government have. But I think the most appropriate approach will be to provide some safety nets and some stimulus that will help shove up some part of the economy. But the issue is whether the African government have the physical space to be able to do that. Most African countries currently are in debt distress and do not have that physical space to be able to make those kinds of investments. So most of them are going to find themselves having to choose between servicing their debt and then addressing some of the immediate concerns that they have. And that is where the challenges that come from for most African countries now.
Wonderful. So I want to turn a little bit more to the micro effects. And Kwame mentioned some of those micro effects as well, outside of the big industries that we can mention. And I'm curious, Gloria, what some of the hardships look like for citizens. And as these lockdowns either stay in place in some countries, or as we see in some countries like Ghana become relaxed, how are people going to respond? How might those hardships change or evolve in some form?
Well, as Dr. Yeboah just mentioned, Africa already has a lot of different challenges, and this pandemic is only stretching again a capacity that was already stretched to begin with. Some of the hardship, I'll start with the really basic needs. It's just for people who are struggling to meet their daily needs, like food, and especially people who have children, how to feed their families, how to feed themselves. And we are seeing also people who are losing jobs. Again, Dr. Yeboah mentioned it. Most African governments just do not have the bandwidth or the capacity to help small businesses and companies. So it's really is tough on all fronts. Again, it's employment that is at risk right now, and just the capacity to be able to meet the daily needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Meeting the daily needs. Kwame, why don't you reflect on some of those issues that Gloria has just raised?
Well, I think Gloria was on point, and I foresee two main immediate effects. One has got to do with the employment and the loss of livelihood. So the AU analysis, which I referenced earlier on, estimates that we're going to have job losses up to about 2 million jobs, right? Both in the formal and the informal sector. And bear in mind that even before the crisis, the continent faced a job deficit of about 8 million jobs annually in the formal wage sector for its growing youth population, right? And much of the jobs that we have in Africa is in the informal sector, where there are no safety nets. So those individuals need to work in order to be able to get something to eat. Unlike in the US, where you have unemployment benefits, they don't have any of that. So their ability to be able to cope with this situation is really going to be dire. So the longer they stay under lockdown. And then the second part will have to do with food security. If you look at the data, about 80% of food that is consumed on the continent by consumers, it's actually procured through the markets. So if people do not have means to be able to make money by working, access to food is going to be limited because they will not have that the means to be able to procure that. And then food distribution largely is done through small and medium and micro enterprises in the wet markets, and they are normally in small quantities, right? Those markets are currently being affected. So there's also a limit to access to those kinds of food sources. And then you compound that with some of the disruptions in the supply chains of those food products from the lockdown and the border closures, which could potentially lead to food shortages in certain parts of of Africa. And those shortages could also lead to some price hikes, which we're already seeing in some parts of the continent because of speculative hoarding. So the longer this goes on, the more dire the circumstances would be. And I personally believe that these two effects, if it is not well managed, could lead to social unrest and conflict if we are unable to deal with it properly.
And just a quick follow-up on that, how about imports as well? You've talked a little bit about the domestic sort of supply chain, but how about the international supply chain? You mentioned oil and some of this as well, but I'm curious, what does that look like, particularly for countries on the continent that are fairly dependent on imports for food and other stuffs?
So Africa also has an issue with food imports. So if you think that food imports alone was estimated of about $45 billion around 2014. So we do rely on a lot of imports. And from the last I checked, rice, for example, in Ghana, we consume about 38 kilograms per capita. 60% of that is imported. And this is a time where countries like India, Thailand have already announced that they are curtailing the export of rice because they want to be able to protect their own citizens and ensure that they have enough food to eat. So those big supply chains, that's a external supply chain that we used to rely on for our food, may no longer be available to support us. And that is one reason why at this time we need to be looking inwards to see how best we could be able to provide for ourselves during this time of crisis. So that is another issue that we need to be dealing with as a continent.
Yeah, and one last kind of question on this. I know that there were a lot of countries that were dealing with food shortages and food insecurity issues before COVID-19, particularly in the Horn of Africa as well as in East Africa as well. And there was that plague of locusts that was influencing some of the food supply in those countries. What does it look like in those countries that were already in the sort of the food insecure, highly food insecure zone?
Well, you could certainly expect this crisis to deepen some of that. And one other issue too is, as we have seen in the past, in times of health crisis like this, there's a tendency to cut agricultural spending to focus on addressing some of these health crises. But this is also the time where we need to be making some investments. So, for example, in West Africa, this is a time where we need to be spraying for the fall armyworm. But if with the lockdowns, if we miss that window of spraying, we could even experience more food insecurity coming up. So those areas are going to be facing escalating challenges if we do not find measures to be able to address the food insecurity that's already there. But certainly it could be their plight could be deepened.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gloria, I'm just curious about how some of these stories of hardship about the issues of food security, but broadly speaking, hardship are being covered in both the domestic media as well as international media. How would you assess this coverage or telling the stories of those that have faced hardship during this COVID-19 era?
Of course, local media in Africa specifically, they're very present, and they're able to tell the stories of hardships with accuracy. And they've, since the COVID outbreak, I would like to believe that they've done a good job looking at some of the need that are specific to Africa. Again, I'll take the example of Malawi. You know that the government wanted to put in place a 21 lockdown measure, but the High Court had to intervene and stop that from happening because the High Court understands that local people we're going to struggle if that 21 lockdown was implemented without a safety net for people who are in need. And I think on the continent, local media, I would like to believe again that they are doing what is expected of them. Outside of the African continent, at the beginning, when we started learning of more cases in Africa, the media outside first was focusing on what exactly is going on in Africa. It was like a huge mystery because the virus was spreading quite quickly in the US, in Europe, and Africa was slow. It took a while before we started seeing cases coming up, and everybody was wondering what is going on in Africa. How come the virus is not there? And I think for the beginning of the first part of the year, it was mainly everybody's wondering what's going on in Africa. And then when we started getting more cases, then the media narrative changed, and now started highlighting some of Africa's inefficiencies, but specifically when it comes to our health systems. I think international media has mainly covered the difficulties in terms of public health, in terms of health systems, in terms of protective equipment, and very little on the hardships. However, I have to mention that you talked about it, Peter, earlier, that there were countries and regions in Africa that were already dealing with a hunger crisis. And so we have Kenya, we have, again, also the southern part of Africa, Malawi, Zimbabwe. And so those countries, started coming up again in the media and say, hey, there's a major hunger crisis that is coming up in Africa that is going to be accentuated by the pandemic.
Yeah, and I know you've written a little bit about this subject, and it was one of these issues that went viral, was this issue of testing on the African continent. Some of the potential cures to COVID-19, and obviously this came out of that discussion of that French doctor and that viral video. So what was that all about, and how did the media respond to those remarks and to that approach? I'm curious, and did you feel like that response, both domestically as well as in the international media, was appropriate in redressing some of those pretty terrible comments?
Well, just to recap for those who may not be aware of what Peter is talking about, there were two scientists from France who were discussing on live TV about the coronavirus vaccine. And one scientist said, why don't we just start our trial in Africa? Why don't we go to Africa to test if this vaccine is working? And I have to say, international media was largely silent about that incident. However, a lot of the backlash and the critic came from Africans themselves, which was great to see. And the day that video was published, it was trending on Twitter. That's how I got to learn about that story. And Africans they didn't take that well, as we should. That we are seen in this pandemic as this place where people can, you can just come and try if this vaccine is working or not. And it was great to see that coming from Africans, because more and more we're starting to realize our potential as Africans. We are able to address some of our needs. We have the resources. We just need to come together. We need to put our minds together. The expertise that already exists on the continent, as we can see in Senegal is doing a great job. And I think Africa, again, I wouldn't say it was a wake-up call, but it was just good to see that our minds are together when it comes to certain things, that we shouldn't just allow ourselves to be seen as this place where you can just come and do a trial.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for reflecting on that. Kwame, it seems like you have something to say on that point.
Well, I think Gloria makes an important point, and one that I will add is Africa is not just a defenseless victim. Africa has learned from past experiences of dealing with some of these infectious diseases. So if you even look at what is happening in Senegal, they are just capitalizing on some of the lessons that they learned dealing with the Ebola, and tuberculosis. And that is how come we are seeing these innovations happening. So there's a lot of that is happening across the continent. We have people using 3D printers to produce test kits just for $1. They have in areas where people are coming up manufacturing ventilators, and there are also situations where people are even manufacturing items that will help us be able to the public to be able to wash their hands, in like what a young man did in Ghana. So there's been a lot of innovations going on the continent, and that is also one area where I think African governments need to pay attention. That at a time where external support is limited, this is about time for us to look inwards and capitalize on some of these innovations to help create Africa-specific solutions to our problems.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind everyone at this time, before we press on with our conversation, that please share your comments and questions in the chat. It's been pretty quiet thus far, but so please put those in the chat. There is a chat box there. And if you do have a comment that you want to share live on air, so if you want to share your voice, please go into the Zoom room to share your voice. You do not need to be, obviously, in the Zoom room to hear today's discussion. You can watch on YouTube where we are broadcasting live. But if you do want to have a comment, please come into Zoom, and we will hopefully share your comments very shortly. I know there are a number of you waiting to share your thoughts. Please make sure your thoughts are formed before you get into the Zoom room, and then we will share those live. Thank you very much. All right, Kwame, I want to come back to this, something that has been coming up that we've been talking a lot about, which is this issue of social safety nets. And around the world, social safety nets are being exercised in a variety of different forms because of the gross economic impacts of COVID-19. And what we mean by what we mean by some form of social safety net, we're talking about unemployment insurance or stipend or social grants that would be tailored towards dealing with those who are unemployed. Some countries have those in place already, some countries don't, as well as direct transfers or supports for small and larger businesses as well. They all sort of make up this broader sense of a social safety net. So what does that look like? Why don't you explain sort of before the COVID-19 era, what that social safety net looked like, the diversity that was present, and then reflect on, how that social safety net is either meeting or not meeting some of the concerns that countries are facing.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for that question. I would say that obviously the impact of the pandemic demands some kind of a social safety net or support for the vulnerable. Again, I'll go back to what I had said earlier on. Even during normal times, the social safety net was largely absent in most part of Africa. There have been some cases where, excuse me, there have been some cases where we've had conditional cash transfers for the extreme poor, and I know that have been implemented in Ghana, have been implemented in Kenya, and that help provide cash for individuals or households that are very poor and are not able to meet their food needs. But largely, social safety net is not present on the African continent. And in this time of crisis, the key concern is whether the various countries have the physical space to be able to implement some of that in light of the debt burdens that they are carrying. The second concern is also the mechanism with which to deliver those social safety nets. When you talk about unemployment, a large part of those people are employed in the informal sectors, and those informal sectors are not even registered. So when the government want to roll out a program, for example, if they say tax reliefs, those people are not even registered. So any tax reliefs is not going to be beneficial to those companies or those small and micro enterprises. because of the informality space where they operate. But I've also seen that some governments have become a bit creative in trying to provide a social safety net during this time. So one of them I see in Ghana, where they announced that water bill, electricity bill, utility bills will be forgiven at least for about 3 months during the time they are there. Everybody uses water, everybody uses that. And those areas where those utilities are absent, there have been mechanisms to send trucks that can go in there and deliver water to them. There have also been feeding programs at different centers to help provide food for those vulnerable. So those are some of the things that we are seeing across the country. And I must also say that civil society have stepped in big time to help meet some of those needs and supplement those areas where governments are unable to assist. So that is where things are. But the structures will really need to be developed if we are have a strong social safety net system on the continent.
And I, before getting to following up with you, Gloria, we do have a comment from Patrick Ogby in the chat there, and I'll just read it, who I assume is joining us from Ghana, and Kwame, as a fellow Ghanaian, perhaps you can address this. And one of the things that he mentions is that in Ghana particularly, the crisis has really exposed the weakness of social welfare in the country. React to that. Do you think that's sort of an accurate portrayal, or do you think there's a good foundation on which to build post-crisis?
Well, I would say that those social welfare and the lack of, I would say previously there were some attempts to provide some of those support. Like I mentioned, I talked about that. The conditional cash transfer program. Ghana had a livelihood empowerment against poverty program that provides cash to, I think it was the extreme poor, those the extreme 20% of the poor, right? But there are others who are, I would say, just $1 to falling into their category of being the extreme poor, and those individuals are not covered. And this crisis, which is a shock, has a tendency to push all those individuals to join the ranks of those in the extreme 20%. But currently, they may not be in the books of the government. So I would say his assertion will be right. And if it's possible to do something about it, I think that will be helpful. And I will say also that within the African context, much of the support have come from the family system, which have been the major social support. Unlike other areas where it have to be governmental or where it has to be the individual trying to pull themselves up. So that social capital that African countries or Eastern societies has been a major safety net that make up for what government is unable to provide. And this time of crisis too, it's one thing that I believe that most people are going to be relying on to meet their needs.
Absolutely. And so, Gloria, I've got a couple questions about CSOs and them sort of picking up the slack for the problems and the gaps in the social safety net. But I want to get a call first. And this call comes from Sarpong Hammond Anchi, who's joining us from Dublin, Ireland. And so I'm going to patch him through now. Hopefully he can hear. Sarpong, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. And thanks for getting me on board. I'm enjoying the discussion. I think it's a great perspective from all speakers. And the little I would like to add or access the fact that if you look at all the outputs there, it seems to indicate that the future of Africa economically will not be that sound. But I hold the view that I think we should think of also quantifying the benefit that COVID has brought, looking at the fact that I can take Ghana, for instance, where currently government is now empowering local manufacturing companies to go into PPE production. I think there is one major company producing sanitizers on the large scale. And you look at the fact that even government thinks of building hospitals within a limited period of time, hitherto, which might not be. So I want to ask both speakers that beyond the negatives which even existed before COVID, can we quantify the benefit that COVID might bring despite the death and other related issues, and the future beyond COVID, on how Africans can start believing and finding localized solution, just as maybe in Madagascar with regards to a herbal drug? As to whether it's effective or not is another discussion, but I think it tells us that COVID has prompted us to start thinking locally. So is there a way we can also look at the entire benefit COVID brings as far as local ideas, local thought, and local SME empowerment is concerned? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Song-Hong. Really good question. So is there a silver lining, in a sense? Gloria, why don't you take the first stab at that? What do you think?
Absolutely. For me, I'm convinced that a crisis is also an opportunity for us to see where we failed, where we lack, and where our weak systems are. And the moment we realize that, it's a good start for us to start again using the innovations that we seeing coming up during this time. We talked about Senegal. Senegal is a great case. They've been able to create mobile kits to test the virus, which are going for $1. The 3D printed ventilators, which are going for $60. I hope other African countries can look into what Senegal is doing and see how we can produce that on a larger scale. So that is just one example. And masks. Africa has so much talent. I haven't stopped seeing pictures of all kinds of masks that small businesses like tailors are creating. So my hope is that going forward, we will continue to look inwardly and see what else can we do for ourselves, because as we discussed, the potential is there, the resources are there. We just need to shift the way we think about ourselves, and I think the pandemic has given us that opportunity to start shifting that mindset.
How about you, Kwame? Building on what Gloria said, some signs of hope. What do you think?
I think I'm very hopeful that if we manage this crisis well, it could be a turning point from our dependence on other regions for the food service, for the food and even products that we need. And I've been very much encouraged by what I've seen from a number of African countries. Gloria mentioned about what is happening in Senegal. Sapon, who just called in, talked about the manufacture of PPEs, even in Ghana. And I also know effort by the Ghanaian government to expand local production of major pharmaceuticals to make sure that those medicines that we need, which before now were imported, could be manufactured locally. So to the extent that we're able to put in the needed structures, that will help us position us to be stronger in the post-COVID-19 era. It could be a big turning point for the continent. And I'm very hopeful that we will be able to take advantage of this.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to this discussion that's happening now globally about building better than before, right? What can one use this sort of shock to build up systems better, either social welfare, either internal investments in infrastructure and in science and alike, and it's moments like this perhaps that makes us consider some of those options more than we otherwise would, right? And sort of break the thought monopolies that have been present in many ways. So I think that I think that's a really important thing that Gloria and you, Kwame, have sort of reflected on. And thanks, Sarpong, for your questions again. Please feel free to have call in or put your questions in the chat. It's very easy for us to show those and discuss those. And we have about 15 minutes left, so please bring those in and we will discuss them as they come up. Now, I want to come back to this question that before Sarpong asked this question about the social safety nets and the role of non-governmental organizations in this piece. And there are many that offer critiques of NGOs, particularly because they sort of pick up the slack for doing things that the state should be doing themselves, right? In normal circumstances, right? Filling in those gaps. So how much, Gloria, are you kind of concerned when you see NGOs taking some of the key steps in the forefront of dealing with some of the impacts of the virus? Or are you not so concerned about the role of NGOs and think that this is sort of an important and productive relationship and productive arrangement there?
I think definitely NGOs do play an important role every day, and even more so during this pandemic. It's usually NGO operate in places where governments have limited capacity, where resources are already stretched because they have relationship with different donors. They are able to bring into the country, to help to support the government. Most of the times, I would like to think that most NGOs, at least the ones that I'm aware with, like to work with governments that are already with local governments, and so it's an important relationship because no man is an island, especially during this pandemic. The world is more united than ever, and so the support of NGO is very, very important. They have access that the local government may not have. They're able to put resources together from different governments and from different donors and support the effort that our local officials are already doing. And during this time, really, I would like to think that, the support of NGO is very important, but more so the support of the civil society organization who are already based within the country and are operating there. It is very, very crucial for governments to partner with civil society organization, because civil society organizations most times operate where the people are. They are very well aware of the needs. They are able to mobilize on the ground in a way that a government office might not be able to do effectively. So unity is important between governments, between organizations, whether it is the private or the public sector. I think any support right now is needed.
And Kwame, do you see also that level of cooperation and support and sort of mutual problem solving between governments and NGOs, both international NGOs as well as more local civil society organizations?
Well, I think I will echo what Gloria had said, that there is a need for that mutual support between governments and NGOs. And in a time of a pandemic like this, you need all hands on deck. So we can't afford to have just one side working when the other side is not working. So we really need the support of each of both the government and NGOs. And I would also want to add that in terms of creating lasting changes, governments seem to be better placed to make those lasting changes. So even as NGOs will play an important role in this, we should not be looking at NGOs as an alternative to governmental structures, because typically you have NGOs have project cycles, 5 years, and the project ends. But governments are there for a much longer time. And to the extent that you work with government, you're able to institutionalize solutions that last for a long time. But that coordination between government and NGOs is going to be very critical if we are to successfully address the fallout from this pandemic.
So I want to just look at the political aspect, and obviously those who don't know me, I'm a political scientist myself. And we've been talking largely about economics, but obviously economics and the state of the economy is connected to the electoral fortunes of those who are in power. And many countries are holding elections this year. I know Ghana is purported to hold elections later this year. Obviously, a lot of elections, like in Ethiopia, have been postponed, but Ghana is still on track to hold elections this year. Cote d'Ivoire is also on track to hold elections this year. Malawi is in the process of rerunning a presidential election that was overturned by their court. So there are a lot of electoral processes. And I'm curious, Gloria, why don't you take a stab at this one first? How is sort of COVID-19, the response and sort of the economic impacts influencing campaign environments in countries that are, going towards elections this year? Don't worry, Kwame, I'll get you in on this one as well, because I know there's been a lot going on in Ghana surrounding this. Gloria, what do you see in terms of the campaign dynamics around the response to COVID-19?
Well, Peter, the pandemic has taken a toll on a lot of campaigns already. As you've mentioned, there are a couple of African countries that are preparing for elections this year. I'll take the example of Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire is having an election on October 31st. And right now, the pandemic has really interfered in a lot of the processes that were already put in place for this election to happen. Cote d'Ivoire started with registration in mid-February, voter registration, because the country is moving to biometrically secured polls. And so for that to happen, they needed to have a biometric registration for each member of the public, so that they may be able to vote, but the process is not going as planned. It started mid-February. The country has a plan to at least register 6.5 million people. However, we now, towards the end of April, news that I got recently is that there's less than 200,000 people who have been able to register so far. So that's a major challenge. And the plan is that by end of July, we should have electoral rolls ready, but I don't know if that's going to happen. The country, however, does not want to push elections. So it remains to see what happens in Cote d'Ivoire, but the pandemic has really taken a toll on the electoral process. And I would like to believe that it's the same in many other countries.
Yeah, those logistics part of elections is oftentimes the things that people forget about that happens outside of the campaign environment. And as you mentioned, Gloria, a lot of countries have to redo or refresh their voters' roll. And for those of the countries that are using technologies, biometric registration to do it, it's a whole other process that has to be done alongside the election. So I think those points are really important. So Kwame, what does it look like to you in terms of how this is functioning into the campaign? You can also comment a bit on Ghana's campaign environment as well, if you'd like.
I think Ivory Coast's environment is no different from what is happening in Ghana. The Electoral Commission of Ghana is considering compiling a new voter register, which, should this lockdown continue, could be impacted. Because the number of people that will be risking their lives to go out and register could be impacted. But then you also see the perceptions about how government is handling this crisis. That we say one's test of leadership is one's measure of one's leadership qualities is tested during times of crisis. So governments in power has an opportunity to be able to demonstrate to its citizenry that they care about them and they are able to take care of them. And that could translate into electoral fortunes. And in Ghana, for example, we've seen bold leadership coming from the government in terms of trying to handle this situation, which many believe could help them, could help shove their electoral fortunes. But much still it's yet to be seen about how various African countries deal with the challenges, the logistical challenges associated with election that COVID-19 might bring.
Yeah, I've noticed also, just building on what you said, I've noticed in Ghana that there's been this sort of competition of who can procure the most goods, right? Who can use this opportunity to show that they can redistribute after they've elected. A new opportunity, right? Obviously, they're the traditional ones in the agricultural sector, in the productive sectors, but you see John Mahama trying to give donations and sort of doing his own privately financed efforts, and then obviously the government experts. So it's really interesting to see how there's a bit of competition. I guess the question that I have, and going back to this discussion, is this going to materialize into some sort of program of actual sustainable reform, right? So everyone's saying that we need to redistribute, we need to deal with these hardships. But do you sort of see this as an opening for some form of large-scale reform? And if so, what are those areas of reform that we would expect? Gloria, why don't you take a stab at that one?
Just to clarify, is this generally or politically specifically?
Just generally speaking.
Generally speaking, I think definitely we'll see reform. There needs to be political will to implement lasting changes after the pandemic. And on the health sector, definitely I'm hoping that our governments can invest more and channel more resources and manpower into our public health systems. Because again, we've talked about Senegal a lot today, but not only in terms of producing equipment needed for the pandemic, but also in terms of research, investing more into science, investing more into our labs and research to sort of move into that direction and not rely on the outside world for some of our needs. And Dr. Yeboah mentioned that on the economic side, safety net, there's pretty much nothing right now in terms of safety net. If the world were to come to a standstill like we're experiencing now, so many people are left hanging. We need to look into that. What can we put in place in terms of safety nets so that when we face a pandemic like this, our governments have measures in place to support our most vulnerable people.
Mm-hmm.
And then Peter, I think I will also add the issues of infrastructure, right? So currently we have a number of places where food has been produced, but we can't even get them from those rural areas to market centers where they could be sold or distributed efficiently. And those infrastructure is going to be critical. I know the continent have signed the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, but to implement that, we need solid infrastructure to be able to allow for movement of goods and services across the continent. And currently, the continent have a huge infrastructure deficit. So, at a time where we are unable to rely on external trading partners, there's a time for us to address most of those logistical infrastructure challenges and some of those non-tariff barriers to trade so that we can trade among ourselves. For example, sometimes we have Zambia may have a surplus of maize, but they cannot supply to Zimbabwe, which is just next door. So although because of import bans coming from Zambia, we need to try and deal with some of those ones, and then make sure that we are more represent a united front and take care of each other. So infrastructure will be one area where I foresee us making major reforms if we are going to be competitive in the future.
Absolutely.
Just to add, Peter,
ahead,
one thing we haven't talked about today is education, and I see that also as one area in which we need to bring in reforms, because when kids are home, no education, not going to school, very few schools are able to offer education online, technology, and I think our education systems also, we need to take a hard look at our educational system and see how we can improve and put resources into online education.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this whole discussion right now about schools that have gone online across the globe, but particularly in areas where internet access is not present and it has not penetrated deep enough. There are all those issues surrounding education and the role of distance education in that. I know we're up against time, so I want to get to a few quick comments before we close out today, because we will be closing. We like to keep our discussions to an hour, so we're going a little bit over, but a couple quick comments here. This one comes from Patrick. He's talking about data, and he says, data has been a problem in this pandemic. Figures by government in the last few years with regards to the growth rates and reserves in Ghana don't make sense. The amount of money borrowed is alarming. So I want us not to deal with maybe the particulars of this case, but how good is our data? When we're making these policy decisions and we're discussing when it comes to economic policy, for example, how good is our data that we're using to rely on? And for all those listening, what are some good data sources they can look at when they're considering, quality data when it comes to economics? Kwame, why don't you briefly touch on that issue of data?
Well, the issue of data is certainly a challenge when it comes to the continent of Africa. That there has been some efforts over the past couple of years to help improve data collection. I do know at least the World Bank effort under the LSMS, the Living Standard Monitoring Surveys, which is implemented in different African countries. Some of them are even panel data sources. So that has been very helpful in securing quality data, which could help with decision making. I also know that a number of African countries are stepping up in terms of their national statistical services that are collecting regular data, which has been to help with provide vital information that government needs. And there are also a growing number of African policy institutes and think tanks. So, for example, I'm aware of one, the RENAPRI, which is a regional network for agricultural policy research institutes that is currently operating in multiple countries in Africa, which has been a major force that is gathering data. It's collecting primary data and liaising with their external partners to provide sound economic advice to governments on what to do during these times of crisis.
Mm-hmm. Gloria, you want to touch anything on this issue of data before we close?
But maybe from an innovation standpoint, what I've seen, maybe not economic data, but data having to do with the coronavirus itself. Again, it's been an area where I've personally seen innovation coming from local engineers back in the DRC. There's been a partnership between web designers and engineers back in the DRC and some who are based in the diaspora who came up with an idea to create a hub, a website where they are putting updates in terms of the number of people who are infected, in which cities, to keep the public informed, because right now there are very few places and mainly international organizations that are providing that kind of information. But again, I've seen young people coming together to sort of creating these platforms. Again, it's early days, it's a very new platform, it still needs to grow and develop. But yeah, it's one of the initiatives that have been coming up, and we look forward, as we said, to these initiatives growing up and gaining more steam even beyond the pandemic.
Wonderful. Well, we're up against time, and I want to thank again the audience for their contributions today, but in particular I want to thank our panelists here, Gloria and Nzeka. Thank you for your contributions, who is an international communications expert as well as an expert in issues of information and dissemination of information. And then Kwame Yeboah, Professor Kwame Yeboah, who is the assistant professor of international development at Michigan State University. Thank you to you both for joining in our conversation today at Leaders of Africa Live. Thank you so much.
A pleasure.
Thank you for having us. My pleasure, Peter.
So before we close, I want to emphasize a few more things on how you can connect with us and keep this conversation going. The first way you can connect with us is join one of our social media platforms that we have for Leaders of Africa. So we have a Facebook group. If you go to Leaders of Africa and you search that in Facebook, you will find our Facebook group. On Twitter, we are at Leaders Africa. If you follow us there on Twitter, we are also on LinkedIn if you search Leaders of Africa. So feel free to join those platforms. We also have a Telegram messenger group that you can use, and that will be displayed after today's session. We encourage you to get involved and to join, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel, so that way you get alerts when we do go live. And we hope to go live every couple of weeks. So every month or every 2 weeks, we're hoping to do these live sessions, again, interactive, so that you are able to have your say, ask your questions of some of the foremost experts on a variety of development topics. And so thank you for joining us from wherever you're joining us. It seems like all around the world, including across the continent of Africa. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, my name is Peter Pinar. We'll see you and catch you the next time around. Thanks and have a great day.